everybody. Welcome. It is Shadow at Night for Wednesday, November the 27th, 2024. And on the show tonight, this happened very quickly. I wasn't expecting to have a guest on the show tonight. And then got into a conversation with a friend called Jan. And we started talking about that interview that Patrick Bet-David did with Annaka Lucas and how that is just raging across the internet these past couple of days. And Jan started talking about a friend of hers who had been through the hell of MK Ultra back in the late 1950s and the early 1960s. And I went, yeah, MK Ultra, that's brutal. Jan connected us. Lady's name is Ann Diamond. She is an author and a survivor of MK Ultra, the MK Ultra experiments that were held in Canada between 1957 and 1964. They went on longer in the United States. And many people, when we say that, when we find that out, are surprised that MK Ultra happened in Canada if they don't know about it. And the other thing that you get a lot of is the second you say MK Ultra, a normie will start saying, conspiracy, you're a conspiracy theorist, even though it's documented. It is a part of history. It's a very dark part of history, and we're going to hear much, much more about it tonight from Ann Diamond, who lived it as a very young child. The Shadow at Night live stream is brought to you by CanadaNanoSilver.com. CanadaNanoSilver.com, the toothpaste, man. It's awesome. It comes in multiple flavors, cinnamon, spearmint, and bubbleberry for the children. Naturally whitening helps keep your teeth clean with triple action nano silver. Silverceuticals is made from only the highest quality ingredients. This unique toothpaste is kid safe, uses powerful natural ingredients. Triple action nano silver helps clean your teeth, promotes healthy teeth and gums, and then above ground, mined coral calcium helps to scrub and remineralize your teeth, right? Get the toothpaste in all three flavors, bubbleberry, spearmint, and cinnamon from CanadaNanoSilver.com. If you're looking for a retail location, you can find one. There's over 30 all across the country, scattered in Quebec and Newfoundland, Manitoba, Ontario, Saskatchewan, Alberta, British Columbia. All of the locations are on the retail locations tab on the website. And if you would like to become a retailer yourself of these awesome products, get a hold of Kevin and Anna through the contact tab at CanadaNanoSilver.com. Again, that is CanadaNanoSilver.com. Quickly, some hellos. Who's watching tonight? Dan is watching in Ross, Manitoba. Hello, Kathy, watching in New Brunswick. John is watching tonight. John, where are you watching, John? Are you in Manitoba? Lulu is... You guys, you stop telling me where you're watching from. Sally's watching from, oh, you're in Quebec. All right. Linda's watching in Calgary tonight. Hello, Greg. How you doing? Bren is watching in Cambridge, Ontario. Robert's watching in Kelowna. This is more like it. Colleen is watching in Madoc, Ontario. Sharon is watching in Swift Current, Saskatchewan on YouTube. And Eddie, Tony, they're watching from Calgary. Lucette is watching in Saint Jean Baptiste. Wherever you guys are watching from tonight, on whatever platform, whether it's Facebook, whether it's YouTube, whether it's X, Twitch, Rumble, Telegram, ShadowDavis.com. Get it out there to as many people as you possibly can simply by liking and sharing. Let's get this out there. It's very important people learn about this and the fact that it was real. It happened. There are people out there who can tell the stories like Ann Diamond, who joins us right now. Hello, Ann. Thank you for coming on tonight on such short notice. I know you've got a trip planned and you're at a bed and breakfast right now. You're not at home, but you're taking the time to come on and talk to us tonight. I want to, before we actually begin our conversation tonight, I want to let people know that MK Ultra, even though it was an experiment that was funded and started by the CIA, that's the Central Intelligence Agency in the United States, these experiments did happen in Canada. And they were coordinated and run by a guy called Dr. Donald Cameron. He was a Scottish psychiatrist, creator of psychic driving, this concept, which is strange. The CIA found that interesting, so they brought him aboard. And interestingly, he was part of the Nuremberg trials, trying to get a psychoanalyst of Rudolf Hess, I believe, in 1947. He also introduced something called electroconvulsive therapy, using electrodes on a patient's head at 30 or 40 times the normal power, whatever the normal power would be when somebody attaches an electrode to your head. And again, thank you for coming on tonight. I appreciate you taking the time. How you told me just before we went on live tonight that you were 4 years old when you were drawn into this nightmare. How did this happen?
I'm smiling because I'm playing with my phone. I was trying to send some last minute messages to people to tell them, and now they're all texting me back, so I had to switch them off. Excuse me. Good evening. Hello. It's nice to meet you. Yes, I was 4 years old when I got, well, essentially I was sold to Dr. Cameron by my father, who was an Air Force intelligence officer and a Montreal and a school teacher at the time in Montreal, and I think was being blackmailed also and pressured into handing his children over to this, what seemed to be, I don't know, a very interesting and important and for national security and a patriotic, effort to fight communism, or, at McGill, this psychiatric experiment that they were
And
running.
is that how they were selling it to people, as a fight communism campaign? We need volunteers to come and help us run experiments. Was that what they were doing?
In the United States, that's what that went over, of course, with Americans much more. It was, it really, 1953 is when MK Ultra officially was signed into existence by the CIA director Alan Dulles at the time, and his whole thing was fighting communism. It was the Red Scare. He used the threat of communism to push through all kinds of, his own agendas, and he was a master of disinformation, I guess you could say, and counterintelligence, and he ran a network around, he was an amazing man. A terrible man. And there's a book about
amazing and terrible evil, I would say, and he's got an airport named after him down there too. It's crazy.
Yeah, Dulles Airport, yeah. And he was behind, I would say he was probably behind the Kennedy assassination, definitely a big player in that, because Kennedy had, it's a whole story. Dulles wanted an invasion of the Bay of Pigs, and Kennedy was trying to, anyway, Kennedy was against his plan to attack Cuba. And so it seems he had Kennedy killed. I mean, that's one of the strong theories that are
You know
out
what
there.
we should say before we go any further, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Anne. What we should say, because last night's show, we had a vaccine injury on last night. And even though it's been diagnosed by doctors, YouTube decided, or at least their algorithms decided, to take that show down today. So what we should say before we go, censorship. So before we go any further, what we should say to the YouTube algorithm, I'm saying this right to your face, AI, is that tonight we are talking about factual things that a person has actually been through in her life, but we'll also throw out some theories as well regarding certain things, because there's so much that we can discuss tonight. And and here's something for a little bit down the road. We don't need to get into this right now, just because the viewers, right, they're anxious to have you on. And they didn't know, and I didn't know up until this afternoon, that you dated Leonard Cohen. And he was
that's not a major distinction in Montreal for women of my generation. I mean, most of us dated Leonard Cohen at one time or another. I'm just kidding. No, I knew him quite well, actually, and I lived next door to him, and it's a whole it's actually a part of my story, but it depends how far you want to go down the rabbit hole. But I think I knew him as a child, and I think the reason I knew him was that he was part of this program at the Allen Memorial at McGill University too. Only he was much older. He was a young man, and I was a little girl. But so I think
let's go back to when your story began. You said that your dad sold you into this situation, which I find very alarming.
Horrible.
You were 4 years old. what do you remember from this?
4 going on 5. It might, and I think on my 5th birthday, that's when the check was written, and there is a record of a check being written on my 5th birthday, 1956, April 1956. What was the agreement? Did you ask me?
Well,
What did
I
you?
mean, yeah, like tell us the agreement. Sure.
Who knows? I mean, I was 5 years old. I didn't witness this. How do I
No,
know?
but you
Well,
researched it later on, obviously. I mean, I'm sure you found out. Do you know the agreement?
I assume it, well, there's photos of me. I'm all dressed up as if, it seems to have been taken at military bases. These photos of me as a little girl. I'm kind of dressed up in an almost military way, and I'm smiling for the camera. Basically, I'm being put in. I've been designated. I've been identified as a gifted child. It's a gifted program. My parents are told, and I will be put through interesting, challenging situations, and I will if I overcome, at the I will be chosen perhaps for a career at the United Nations or some glamorous occupation in media or uh, government, something. I have an IQ of whatever it is. And they have decided that I'm worth um, training. So that, I think, was what my parents were told. My mother once, I heard my mother say to someone, when I was a child, that the scientists were very interested in both her children. I had a twin brother, and we were both in the program initially. So it was presented to parents as a very, it was flattering. It was a positive
Yeah. It was
offer,
for advanced
option.
kids. It was like you're going to jump 8 grades. You've got a genius for a daughter, and we can help her to a
Through a
great
lot of these
life and a
programs.
great career. And how were they selling it through schools, or was it an ad in the paper? Do you know, or were they
Um,
knocking on doors?
I think in my case, my family's case, it was through my father's Air Force connection, and the Air Force is very important in this story, Royal Canadian Air Force, because several of the MK Ultra doctors had Air Force backgrounds. They were officers. That includes Cameron and Penfield and Donald Hebb, and a number of Dr. Roper, Dr. Peter Roper. It was a huge Air Force input into the program. The Air Force also had, connections with secret societies too, and then the aerospace program. All of these things fit into the kind of the background of what they were doing. What they were trying to develop they were thinking in terms of developing super soldiers too back then, and psychic spies and mercenaries, and that was, they were training kids in those kinds of things at McGill. You've heard about super soldiers,
Well,
underground base, and
I've heard it from the Marvel movies. I didn't know it was actually real. I mean, that's how they
you
made
can.
Captain America, according to Marvel
Oh
and
yeah, it's
Disney.
entertainment. Yeah. No,
So
it's
you,
gone into everything. It's been in comic books. It's been on television for decades. I mean, The Man
yeah,
from U.N.C.L.E., which I watched as in high school when I was 14. I was addicted to that show. If you look at it, you look at the scripts. Obviously some of the people writing for that show were very well informed about the MK Ultra program, because they brought in elements of it often. Reanimated
so
Nazi doctors with poison gas. And yeah, super soldiers and that kind of thing. It's all
predictive
there in the
programming that
60s.
they deny is a thing, has been a thing, Operation Mockingbird and whatnot, for over 50 or 60 years now. But let's go back to the day that you first went into this program. Did they just take you to the university and drop you off and say, we're not going to be seeing you for a while, sweetheart?
Well, I don't,
I mean,
one thing
I
I
know
should say,
I know that they screwed with your brain for years, and
yeah,
I know that some memories are
okay.
there, and I know that some memories aren't. So if you don't remember, just say, hey, look, that's something I don't remember. But and I'm
Well,
sure you've told
I
this
couldn't
story
tell
a
you.
bunch. Go ahead.
I couldn't tell you on a day-by-day basis how it unfolded. I think on that day, I remember that birthday, and I think we went for a drive in the country, and it was sunny, and I remember I got presents and we celebrated. I mean, I got booked the Bobbsey twins, and they're 5 years old today. That's what I do actually remember that day. But it also happens to be the day that the check was written for $3,000 to my father. And $3,000 in 1956 is about 35,000 now. It was a chunk of money. And
Yeah.
so, so there was the financial incentive for my parents well, my father was a teacher, but, we weren't rich for sure. And that year he bought a new car, and we moved into a house in the suburbs from our apartment in a military housing kind of project in Montreal. And we moved to the suburbs, and yeah, I was a breadwinner. But how did it work itself out? I piece it together from different sources and documents and so on. And I believe there was a party in August of 1956, I believe it was, and we went there in a limousine, and there were other children, lots of children, chosen children at this party, but parents were not allowed to attend. So it was my brother and me in a room with, I don't know, 50, 60, I don't know how many other kids, and experiments. The games were based around experiments. Some of them were ESP games. Some of them were physically, demanding, sporty, sort of even violent games. And different things happened during that afternoon open house party for children in
What
the
is an
program.
ESP game like? What are they trying to
Well, they
ask
would
you? What's
hold up a
behind,
card.
like, what's on the other side of this paper kind of thing?
Yeah, cards, and they'd show you the back of the card and you had to guess what the symbol was on the front.
And for a kid,
Things
that's
like that.
fun, right? I mean, you're at a
Yeah,
party. It's like, oh, look, games. We're having fun. There's pin the tail on the
yeah,
donkey over here, and electroshock over here, and
yeah. There was a game. I mean, listen, my memories, I have memories of certain things that are my memories, and some things, so, but one game that I understand happened that my brother was involved in at 5 years old was called the Jack in the Box. And they put a child in a box, and that chosen child was given an actual sword, an actual sharp sword, and folded into the box. The lid was paper. And another child who was chosen, but a disposable child, was told to attack the box, while the boy inside the box was told to defend himself. And you can imagine what happened.
so it sounds to me like these children, much like the Annaka story that we heard on Patrick Pett David's show a few nights ago. It sounds like the kids were classified by
Yeah.
intelligence or maybe by strength, because you just said disposable child.
Ethnicity.
Ethnicity
Yeah.
it was.
Yeah.
Wow.
And there were disposable kids, and the orphans. You see, if you had parents, well, that meant that they had to account for you because you had to go home. If you didn't go home,
Wait a minute.
you
Wait a
know,
minute. Hold on. You got
I
you
mean,
got
so
we had a bad. I'm
and
sorry,
the
Ann, we had
fact
a bad
also that
connection there.
money, I know.
We've got
All
a
right,
bad
should I start
connection
again
through
at
the
the beginning?
Wi-Fi right now. So I want to make sure that we
Uh-oh.
can all hear everything that you say. So you were going home every day? It wasn't that they just packed you away for good.
Yeah.
You were still going home every day.
Well, they would have to have a good reason for my not going home. If I had parents and lived in a house in the suburbs, right, and in a normal family situation. So there are different scenarios, but I was taken out of school quite often under various pretexts. And I can't say I remember everything that happened, but it appears from people who knew me, for example, have told me, well, I used to be they saw me down in the Bronfman mansion. Well, they saw me downtown. I was at the hospital. So different stories would be told. In one case, my mother enrolled me in second grade. I was in a ballet class, but I never took any ballet. At the end of the year, when we had the recital, they put me in a costume. I had no idea of the routine at all, and I just made a total fool of myself, because in this ballet recital, they still put me in it because my mother was in the audience, but I go the wrong direction. I didn't know what the routine was. It appears the ballet class that I took after school in second grade was a pretext for taking me downtown to participate in other things that were going on, either at the hospital or in people's homes. So it was child trafficking. And
So
yeah,
your own story is based upon, largely anyway, not all of it, what other people have told you about your own life?
it's a mixed bag. I have very clear memories of certain things. Like, I remember being in an underground facility at the age of 4, and children were being tortured. And I remember, and it's very clear, and I've known about it all my life. I even wrote about it in the 80s and published a story about this. So I didn't pull this out of nowhere, from reading conspiracy theories. But yeah, I tried to tell my mother, well, there's this place, and there are witches, and they're torturing the children, and the children were on an assembly line belt, strapped down, and they were these. Well, years later, I read exactly the same scenario coming from a survivor from California, from the China Lake underground military facility, and she describes the assembly line and what was being done to the children, which I witnessed. And that's a clear memory that I had from the age of 4. But my mother, of course, didn't believe me. She said that was a bad dream. And I remember clearly the conversation, right? That she doesn't believe me, but, and I remember, you remember certain things, but you have to also keep in mind that this whole experiment was based on wiping memory, erasing memory. That's what the electroshock was. That's what the LSD was about, right? And hypnosis was being used, and sensory isolation. So I don't know if I'm being clear about what was going on down at McGill. There was a group of children in a laboratory. They lived there. They were disposables because they were orphans. They were from broken homes. The parents were sick, couldn't take care of them. Doctors offered, to take their children, and they were there. They lived there, and they died there also when the project folded in 1963. So,
So
when you said,
no, go ahead. Go ahead.
well, you said my book is fiction.
Partly.
It's definitely not fiction. I know that my family lived through a nightmare in the 1950s and 60s, and I know that. But you have to factor in that the amnesia is a huge part of this.
Were they? Yeah, we just put your website up there.
Yeah.
My Cold War is the name of that book. You've got many others on your website, anddiamond.ca, if you guys want to go check it out. Was it also designed to? Were they trying to input memories into kids that never happened?
I don't know. It's possible that they were experimenting on implanting memories too, but I think the Manchurian candidate. Yes, I mean, the Manchurian candidate programming is about erasing a personality, turning you into a blank slate, and then reprogramming you to be someone else, someone better. They used to say, they claimed that this was a way to cure schizophrenia or different kinds of mental illness, depression, and so on. Cameron's depatterning process was about erasing the personality, and then you rebuild it. You build it back up from nothing. So he would reduce people to infancy. And they did that to my father. My father was a Cameron patient in 1962 for 6 weeks. Around that time, I was in 6th grade, and I thought I was living just a normal, life. I
Of
mean, I
course.
was going to school, and I was just a little schoolgirl with friends and doing sports, and different things were happening. But my father was taken away from us suddenly, and came back 6 weeks later and didn't recognize us, didn't know really who we were. And that was because he'd been depatterned. He'd gone through some drugging and electroshock process at the hospital, the Allen Memorial. He is listed as a Cameron patient. I have a card that shows he was a Cameron patient. His other doctor was a different psychiatrist called Dr. Roper, who I think took charge of him after. And he wasn't able to work anymore. He was taken from school, where he was a music teacher, and taken downtown from school under, I don't know why exactly, but suddenly we were told he was in the hospital. And 6 weeks later, he arrived home and couldn't teach anymore, of course, because he couldn't remember
Why?
his own children's names.
I wonder why they would send him back to you if they had completely and totally wiped his brain. They must have known that he wouldn't recognize you, or maybe that was part of the experiment to see if he would.
They were doing it at that point, 1962, 1963. It was over that winter. They had ramped it up to the point where there were many people that went home to their families and didn't know their families. There were women who had postpartum depression and completely wiped. So they're reduced to infancy. They don't know their own names. They don't know how to go to the bathroom, or they don't. It was obviously completely destructive of the people that they were trying. They said they were trying to help. They were trying to cure of different neuroses. And they would send them home, and the thing is, my father, within a fairly short time, started, he began to come back. He did, then start to remember things, but I know that he was often concealing his lack of memory. He was hiding the fact that he didn't remember things anymore.
Do you remember anything that they did to you? Do you have any memories of that? Or is your childhood from the age of 4, like when did you finally get out of that nightmare?
When did I finally get out of it?
Not to say that because I know that this is probably a lifelong healing process, Anne, because of what they did to you, but when you stopped actually taking part in the programming, I suppose, is what I'm asking.
It's hard, it's hard to give a short answer to questions.
No, it doesn't have to be short. I mean, it doesn't have to. We can go on and on here. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I could. Let me think how to say it. It seems that once my father was put in the hospital in December of 1962. He came home in January of 1963. And we were told, he had been treated. And my mother said he's going to get slowly better. He's going to seem different for a while, but the doctors are optimistic that he had been a really difficult kind of guy to live with in many ways. He was often angry. He had a lot of nervous energy that, and so, he came home and he was very calm. And, and then he sort of slowly recovered his memory. And over that winter, I don't know how to tell this story exactly. It seems that I was unaware of this, the sinister side of this whole thing.
Right.
But he told me one day, we were playing chess or something, because we were interacting. He said, "They're not doing anything good down at that hospital." He just said that to me. And I remember saying, and I was 12, I said, "Dad, they're just trying to help you." And he just snorted, He was aware of what he was seeing, things that were going on, because he was going down on a daily basis to the day hospital that they ran as a public outreach, in the center of Montreal. It was a day hospital, and people came and went. Patients came and went, and so he was observing things that were going on down there, and which includes people, pacing up and down, going, "Who am I? Who am I? I don't know why I'm here. Where am I?" And that kind of thing. So he was getting a good, a good overview of what that place was about. It was nightmarish, actually.
Where were
And
these
so I
people?
hear.
Where were they getting these people? Were they just homeless people from the street, or like?
No, they had a very, the Allen Memorial had a very good reputation, and they had frequent free publicity in the local English newspapers, the Montreal Gazette and the Montreal Star, both of whose owners were investing in the program. They're some of the big donors to this mind control program. So the newspapers were in on it. McGill University was in on it. McGill was getting massive amounts of funding for these kinds of, for programs that were related. And Cameron was a great public relations man. So people had a very high opinion. The NFB, the National Film Board, made a film about how they could help people, how through their new cutting edge psychiatry, and they would go home to their families and they would be able to live normally. People who had had difficulties in relationships before, and they made propaganda film, a very, one in particular. But it was just a kind of common knowledge in a way. It was, the official story was that it was a great place that was helping people, cope and get ready for the future, the new society that was coming.
And nobody had a
all be
clue
very.
what they were really doing. There was because it looked so normal, except for the people walking around not knowing who they were or where they were.
Well, except and by 1960, I was told by Warren Allman, he was the Attorney General of Canada, I think. But before, in those days, he knew of many people who'd been totally ruined by the treatment, and there was a group of people that formed, and they demonstrated outside the hospital. You're killing you're hurting our loved ones. You're not helping them. But it didn't go anywhere. I mean, it was just didn't get newspaper coverage, that's for sure.
So
So
this is a program that essentially existed right under people's noses. People didn't know what was really going on in there because it looked so normal. It's
and it was
like
bringing millions. Yeah, it was bringing in millions. It was allowing McGill to expand and become, a leading hospital. It had always been a center for experimental psychology, and it offered. I think McGill's big drawing card was it had human beings that it was offering as guinea pigs, and and some of that was secret. But some of those guinea pigs were children, and some of the guinea pigs were patients who went in there, and sometimes they go in, because they had a sore arm, and they would end up being diagnosed with schizophrenia, or and then subjected to 2 weeks of this mind control.
so you go in with appendicitis and you come out and you're a completely different person.
You can be totally psychotic or completely just nobody there, gone, blank.
And it's like,
Yeah.
I don't know what happened to the guy. I mean, he was fine when he went in, and then he comes out and he's crazy.
He's a different person. Yeah. And, there's with the lead plaintiff in the case that at the moment is Julie Gold, and her father was a, loving father, but he had some, I forget what it was, neurological issue with his face or something, some chronic pain. And they put him in the Allen, and he came back. He was a monster after that. He terrorized his family.
You're talking about the MK Ultra class action that you were part of that had been launched against the
Yeah.
U.S. government last October. This is a story from the CBC. They said that the Quebec High Court said that the U.S. has immunity in Canada and that they can't be touched. So
The CIA has immunity everywhere. They're above the law, and so our government agrees with that.
is the case progressing at all? Have you heard anything new, or is there going to be an appeal?
At this point, we are appealing, but we have to have the appeal approved. I think the application, I don't know if it's been submitted, but it's now in a waiting phase, and it really feels as though the case is stalled. I mean, to be perfectly honest, a lot of great work has gone into it, and there's 1,000 people who've signed on to it who say their family members were victims. I'm one of the few, I believe, I say, that was actually in there that's still alive, because most of the patients, Cameron's patients, have passed on. But
It
since I
seems to
was
me,
4 years old,
yeah, it
yeah.
seems to me this program was never meant for people to know about it, right? Like it was always secret, and somehow it got out to the public. How did that, do you know how it leaked out to become public knowledge?
Long series. Well, in particular, in 1977, an American writer, journalist, John Marks, wrote a book called The Search for the Manchurian Candidate,
Right.
and it got international attention. It was, in all the media, and it mentioned it talked about many projects, because MK Ultra, I think, was 149 different sub projects across North America. I actually think there were more, but those are the ones that he found files that identified the projects, and he found the financial records, and so from those he was able to make to determine the extent of and how it worked, and who and to some extent who was involved, even though the files are heavily redacted, right? But there's guesswork involved in it too. But anyway, he came out with his book, The Search for the Manchurian Candidate. It talked about Dr. Cameron in Montreal. Dr. Cameron in Montreal was one of the, it's always mentioned whenever anyone talks about MK Ultra. It's like the number one, the worst case of the largest human experiment ever conducted on an unwitting population, in the history of the world of North America. It's a huge thing. It's always at the top of the list when they talk about MK Ultra, and yet in Montreal, it's still pretty much kept secret. I mean, people know about it finally now, but for years, I would say they managed to, they managed to put a whole city under, in a state of amnesia, hypnotize the whole population into thinking nothing
Well, I
bad
mean,
ever happened.
we can talk about Germany during World War II, right? People saying, I didn't know that there were concentration camps. I didn't know they were burning people in ovens. And yet they could see the ashes in the sky. They could smell it. They knew, but they never
Well,
said anything, right? And that's
possibly, yeah,
exactly the
possibly they
same.
knew.
Well, it's the same thing that
Listen,
happened during COVID.
when I was writing My Cold War, which was back in around 2003, I was back in Montreal, and I had already done a massive amount of research while living out in Vancouver, and then came back to Montreal. I swear that I could not go anywhere, couldn't go to dinner, couldn't go to any gathering, or even sit on the bus, and with the person next to me starting to tell me about their story of the family that were Cameron victims. It just seemed that everywhere I went, someone had a family member, somebody knew someone had been in some way harmed by this program. They were everywhere, and yet officially, they managed to limit the okay, after 1977, the Canadian press was forced to admit that this was a real thing that had happened in Montreal. So they did start to release stories on it and reports, and they'd interview people who had survived it and so on, and former patients. But what they managed to do was to it was a limited hangout, in that they talked about some of the worst cases. People were reduced to vegetables. They never recovered, or they committed suicide, or they told a handful of these kinds of stories that were so bad that I didn't, at that time, I was 26. My father had died already a couple of years earlier, so I couldn't ask him. My mother refused to talk to me about it, and I could not really relate my father's situation, his case, to these horror stories, because in fact, he got off fairly easily. Even though he lost his job and he lost a lot of his memory, and he wasn't the same after. The horror stories were so graphic and so extreme that it left out the hundreds and hundreds of people who, had other sorts of situations, sometimes just as bad, but, different. And they kind of controlled the narrative in that kind of way by limiting, and
Yeah.
then they told the story. So now, when I wrote my book in 2000, I was told in 2003, 2004, I started going to publishers, and they would, most of the time, people would say to me when I told them what the book was about, they would say, "Well, that's already been talked to. That's already been written about. Everybody knows that happened." But they thought that it only happened to a few people, and there's been compensation, but not really. No, there's 1,000 people now signed on to the lawsuit, and this is, only using the internet and not much media attention at all.
And that's just Montreal, Quebec, right?
And that's just Montreal, although some of them are across Canada. Yeah, they're across Canada.
You were saying earlier that their objective was to cure mental illness, a different array of mental illnesses through these treatments that they were trying to develop on unwitting people.
That's what they claimed.
Yeah, in the research that you've done, did they have any success with that, or was there a deeper objective? And when you talk about a Manchurian candidate, I guess that's what I'm getting to here, because you did mention to me earlier today something about the Trudeau family and the Bronfman family, and we can talk about that later on as well, because that's very interesting.
So do I think no, I don't think it did anything. I think my father was absolutely right in 1963 when he said to me, "They're not doing anything good down at that hospital." He was. Yeah. So, but it's not in my research. I've never heard of any success stories. I mean, maybe they're out there. Maybe there are people walking around who feel they're very grateful to Dr. Cameron, but I've never heard of any of them.
Right.
I don't. And people now talk about it. Even back then, right after he left, which was in '64. People began saying, "Well, I never believed in his treatments, and it was ridiculous what he was doing." When he had football helmets on people and tapes playing in their head, repeating messages, and he was dosing them with LSD, massive doses of LSD, and then, like you said, the electroshock, which was at a volume, it was, I don't know, several times higher than the maximum, and they would do it a few times a day instead of once or twice a week.
I
They wiped
understand that
people.
verbal and
Yeah.
sexual abuse was also one of the big tools they used. To me, that's and constant yelling and screaming at somebody for every minute of every day until they
Well,
broke.
I don't know about who was doing that. It was more the recordings. They had a technical guy named Rubenstein, and he developed this technology where the tape, the message might be yelling at you, but it would play, it would play in a loop, and you would hear it thousands of times.
Like a
There's a
Clockwork
woman.
Orange, like that movie with
Well, yeah, no,
what's his name?
exactly the same. I don't know about taping the eyes and putting people in the chair, but yes, they were doing that too. They were doing that too. I don't know if they were doing that to their patients or they're doing that to those special, I don't know, delinquents that they also, because they put out a call to the community. If you have a difficult child, we can fix him. And the McGill University and Dr. Cameron worked through a network of high schools in Montreal, but only the English Protestant high schools. The French Catholic, we had two school boards, or more than two, but anyway, we had a Protestant and a Catholic. And the Catholic side were anti-eugenics, so that's one reason why they were suspicious of these kinds of experiments. These were eugenics experiments, that they recognized. But the Protestant school board cooperated, which would mean that the guidance counselor and the teachers and the principals would be looking for kids who would be eligible for the program. And they might be the highly intelligent kids that they were, referring, or they might be the kids that were troublemakers. And anyone they
Depending on
wanted
how they felt, like what did they wanted to do, what they wanted to accomplish, or what kind of personality they try to crack. It could have been.
Yeah, I think they all just thought it was a great thing to get behind, that Cameron was a genius. And, the top of his profession, he was the head of the American, Canadian Psychiatric Associations and the World Psychiatric Association. He was the top guy in his field. So
He
it
was
brought
never arrested
prestige.
also. Never arrested. This guy should
No,
have
he
been
died.
arrested. Yeah.
He had a heart attack. There was
When you
something I
see
meant, you asked me about how did my year go, how did I get out? I realized there is a story I ought to tell you
yes.
about. I told you about my father, being back home and I as the daughter and, trying to relate to him and so on. But there was more going on than that. My father came home from the hospital, but we didn't know he was going to the hospital. We thought he was teaching, but never mind that. My parents didn't want us to think that our dad was a mental patient. So my father would get up in the morning, put on his suit and take his briefcase and go out the door. And we thought he was going back to the high school to teach, to finish the year, finish the semester. But actually he was going downtown to be a patient. Okay, he came home. He'd come home in the evening. So he came home one evening and he had these two pillows, foam rubber pillows. And he said, these are for you kids, and throw away your other pillows. We had these old down feather pillows. They were nice, but now we had these new foam rubber pillows. And we also had a medicine that we took, like a tonic that we took at night. And okay, so what started happening, starting in January of 1963, I was 12 or almost 12, to my brother too, but we didn't talk about it for years, was that we'd go to sleep, we'd take our tonic at bedtime, we'd go to bed and try to go to sleep, but the clock, the bedside clock, tick, 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 would start to speed up or slow down and start to talk, and I start to hallucinate in bed. And I'd hear a voice, and there was a voice in my head. It was a male voice. It kept saying the same thing over and over again, hundreds of times. It said, "You're no good. You will fail. You will never succeed at anything." And I heard that voice. I didn't know where it was coming from. Now I believe it came from Rubinstein's speakers that he had installed. He would install them in pillows. I read about that recently in a book, but it's first time I actually saw it written down. And they were broadcasting the messages electronically. I don't think it was on a tape in the pillow, but I think it was on maybe an electronic signal that was coming through, like a radio signal. And it was Dr. Cameron's voice, because years later I read about a patient and they heard that exact same message repeated hundreds of times when they were down at the hospital. "You're no good. You will fail." It was Dr. Cameron. "You will never succeed at anything." So that I didn't tell either of my parents that this was happening to me. I'd lie awake till 2 a.m., hearing, and then finally get to sleep, and then get up and go to school and try to live my normal life. But my brother told me many years later. He said, "Oh, that happened to me too," but I just couldn't make out what the voice was saying. He said, and it's actually documented in a recent book about the pillows and the speakers in the pillows. It
Wow.
was one of the things there. Yeah.
And
So I don't know.
let me ask you a question. Because there's so many things that you went through and you've researched so heavily these past decades. There's so many things that are
20 years.
relevant to that today. Like, when you look at Justin Trudeau, for example, what do you see?
I see a damaged child. I can't see him any other way. He's a terrible actor. He can't think straight. To me, he's dissociative. He's disconnected from reality. And
Is that
yeah.
is that just from his upbringing, do you think, or is that from something else?
All right. I'm
And this
actually.
is just a wild theory. I'm not saying that this is, like, again, to the AI algorithms who are controlling on YouTube and Facebook.
Oh,
We're just throwing it out there, right?
don't shut us down. Yeah. Well,
Right.
I wrote a piece on Justin Trudeau several years ago, and I noticed it repeats itself on the internet, and people pick up on it, and there is some information in there about him, because I'm essentially an intuitive researcher. I'll be drawn to something by an intuition, and then I find So I don't know if that's confirmation bias or if that's, I just tend to be drawn to questions. So I became interested in Justin Trudeau as a mind control victim. He seemed that
That's
way
where
to
I'm
me.
going with this. Yeah, I'm absolutely going there with this. I've said
Yeah.
this for a very long time now that I think he's a Manchurian candidate, but obviously their formula is still missing a few steps because he is definitely not a success.
No, he's a very
I
sad failure.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's the Trudeau family are just they're a circus, they're monster. They're monstrous, and I say that. I mean, Pierre Trudeau as well. I mean, they are a disaster, and
Well,
Canada has had them. Uh, they somehow define Canada in many ways, and it's because people don't see through them. But no, I think Justin, was traumatized as a child, partly by his parents' marriage and the breakup and what was going on, which was crazy stuff when he was a little kid. And Margaret running off with the Rolling Stones and all the publicity around that, but also just I think Pierre was violent, and there's many people that say that he was violently abusive, and then there's more that I don't know if we can get into that is coming out now with these testimonies, and Annaka Lucas and so on.
right.
So, which I've known about for many years. But I think that even Pierre was part of a network, and it involved the Jesuits, and it involved, a whole network. The Jesuits have their own mind control system that's gone back centuries. So he's a product of that. And then he raised his three sons, and in this crazy marriage. So yeah, oh, but there is another story. And again, I hesitate now whether I should bring it
No,
up, but
no. Go ahead.
it involves well, someone that I met a couple of years ago who was a child in Quebec who was gifted, and he was born in 1975, so he was in Montauk, chosen to go down to Montauk because he's very psychically gifted. And anyway, he has a whole story I can tell you, but his name is Chris Laterreur. He grew up in a small town outside Montreal, and he was at school. They were programming. I mean, this is a whole story I could take. Could take half an hour really to go into. But essentially, the military and the police. There were rogue police and military coming to the school, recruiting children at 6 years old to become mercenaries and super soldiers and work for NASA. Some of these people were American, some were Canadian, and they tested the kids, and he was one of the kids that got into the program. And then he passed all the tests with flying colors, and he proved that he had the ability, remote viewing ability. He could view things at a distance. He could leave his body and travel and get information and come back. Astral travel. He demonstrated those things to them, and they said, "You're the boy." And they took him down to Montauk, which is the place on Long Island that the series Stranger Things is kind of based on,
Yeah.
and a horrible place where thousands of kids died. I mean, it's horrific, the story of Montauk. But he was put in the program there, and then he managed to survive what they did to him and came back home. But he continued to be programmed and accessed in his own school and community. And one of the things that they sent him to see a programmer who he knew as Dr. Green. And he and other boys went to this man's house or his office. And he believes, I mean, he has just his memory to go by, but he said he was flipping through a book on Nazi Germany, and he saw a photo of Reinhard Heydrich, Hitler's second in command, and he said, "That's Dr. Green. That's the man." And he had, there's the whole physical, description of him. He's a huge, tall man with huge hands, and he had a certain type of cane, and certain coloring and all that, and the same face, horsey face, and he's kind of, you would never forget him. Anyway, he knew him in his later years when he was 80, and he was hypnotizing children for the program, working with the space program and for the CIA and the intelligence services and the Montauk program. he was involved in all of that. So, okay, I don't know if I should finish it, but I'll finish the story. Chris says that one time he was leaving the place and he saw Pierre Trudeau get out of a limousine with his son Justin, who was 14 years old at the time, so this was 1985, and go up the steps and into Dr. Green's office. So from that, I mean, there's a network, and it's and if you say it, I mean, the way I say it, people just say, "Oh, well, she's crazy," and she makes stuff up. I'm prone to imagining things, but I think the more we go deeper and deeper with time, and the more attention we pay, and the more research we do, and the more stories come out, the more connections can be made, and the more, to me, it becomes obvious that this has been, this is the story of our lives, really, after World War II. Operation Paperclip and so on. You've read about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm getting here when you talked about this Hitler's second in command, who went by the name of Green over here. He was probably part of that. And who knows if Hitler even really died, right? I mean, there's all kinds of speculation that he never did. Who knows?
We all have our, what is it? We have our limit for how many of these, well, they are conspiracy theories, and how many of these speculative stories we can, take in. I mean, I'm interested in all of it. But
I think that the powers that be want us in that situation. They want us. They want us to not know what to believe. And so they leak some stuff, and then other stuff they say, that's crazy. And now look, I mean, they're having hearings in the United States House of Representatives regarding unidentified flying objects, where for years they said, no, that's just a weather balloon. And now all of a sudden they're talking about it like it's real. And there's people testifying, yeah, I've seen that stuff. So why now are they bringing this out? There's got to be some kind of guiding hand.
Yeah, there's an agenda, you could say. You could say there's a critical mass and they can't hide it anymore, and people are just, waking up, and that would be one reason why they are allowing it to come out.
They couldn't hide it 30, 40 years ago. People knew, right? It's just, maybe it's more acceptable these days. But when you were talking about Pierre and Justin Trudeau going into Dr. Green's office for the hypnosis, are we suggesting then that Justin has been programmed since he was a little kid? I personally think he has been.
I would entertain that idea. I mean, to me, he looks like he's been through trauma. And it's affected him mentally, emotionally. I don't know, but that doesn't connect him to the Nazis necessarily. But here's a story. Here's a story, and then there are the stories from Kathy O'Brien, and there's someone else also. I think Bryce. What's her name? Bryce Ford. What's her name? Susan Ford. Anyway, who also talks about Trudeau in Michigan.
What does she say, or can you say?
It's pretty much parallel to what Kathy Ford, Kathy Ford is someone else. Kathy O'Brien says, and that is parallel to what Annaka just told, the interviewer, that he was a violent pedophile, and he was a programmer. He was a mind control programmer, and he was part of this elite group that included the Clintons and the Gerald Ford and the Bush family and all the players, and the Mackinac Island, I think, was also the location, which is in Lake Michigan.
What do you think about all this? I mean, you mentioned the Jesuits, and we've talked about what Annaka Lucas said to Patrick Bet David the other day. You just referenced it just now. Is there a global network? Is it real?
Don't ask me. I'm not part of it. Well, I mean, yeah, I think.
And you're only giving your opinion here.
I think there's plenty of evidence, that there is. Does that mean? Yeah, I think there is. Do you want to think that? I mean, I think there's always been an elite that has had access to, control, means of
Yeah.
control and information and propaganda and all. There's nothing new about that. And also mind control goes back thousands of years, I think was used in Babylonia, ancient Egypt, and even Greece and Rome. And, I think we've always, look at two world wars, that was mind control that made people, you
So
know.
what about COVID-19? Was that just a mind control operation? Did you see that right from the get-go?
I Yeah, well, I'm trying to think now. Yeah, I think so. I think at least by the time the lockdowns came, when I realized how it was more than a virus, it was or it wasn't just a virus that was threatening me. It was the response to the virus and the all the what they were going to do, make us do. That at that point, I did connect it to MK Ultra. Yeah, for sure. Because I saw the techniques being used, and I remember, watching television one night in British Columbia, just with, in a restaurant where they were playing this, and saying to my friend, how do they get all this? Um, it's a script, and it's written. This is not normal news coverage. This is a program that they must have developed this 6 months ago to have it. Everything was in place. What you must do. These are the rules. Here's what will happen. You must do this. You must, I said, this is not a normal response to a spontaneous threat that's just appeared, where there would be, and normally there would be discussion. There would be, people doing, offering different solutions, and there would be a response like that going on in the media. No, the media had already a program laid out with all the visuals, almost had the music too, they had everything. you know?
That daunting music, right? Like that, dun, 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 dun. Everything they used was a tactic to try and keep people in fear, or first put them in fear and then keep them that way for an extended period of time. And then everything that's happened since then, if we talk about, like, there are people out there, Anne, who actually believe that a man can have a baby, that a woman can be a man, that a man can be a woman. They believe that it's biological reality. And
Almost
it
a
blows
necessity.
it. Like, how on earth have they been convinced of this complete and total obvious nonsense? Again, more
I
MK
really
Ultra?
don't know. Sorry, is it MK
Is-
Ultra? Well, okay. Um,
I mean,
something
MK
I
Ultra,
found.
seriously, they could be using this on a mass scale now, right? We've heard about mass hypnosis or mass formation hypnosis now. Doctors have diagnosed that. And they're using the media, obviously, and
Yeah,
social media to get their message out there. And when you were talking about the pillows and that repeating message, you'll never amount to anything, you're going to fail, all of that stuff. Well, I mean, how many times do we have to hear safe and effective, safe and effective, safe and effective? Or men can be women over and over and over again, right? It's subliminal. They're implanting these messages. And I think the soft-minded people, or the softer-minded people out there, have already
yeah,
been kind of hooked in.
yeah. No, and I think it goes back 60 years and more, maybe, to the war, and I think it actually started. Um, I, well, one place it started was McGill University in Montreal. Where they set up, and it wasn't just 1957, although that's when the sub-project 68 that I believe I was in as a child, right? That's when that ran. But it goes back to right after the war. They were experimenting people even in 1942. There's some people in our lawsuit who had relatives and so on who suffered the same procedures in the 1942. The brainwashing was, they were doing it then. And I think it goes back even farther. So there's been a whole development of social psychology. I'm not an expert in all these things, but you could take it back to Freud, and then you could go beyond that into the 19th century when they studied hypnosis, the first, you know, um, the beginning of psychiatry. So especially in, okay, it took it intensified after the First World War, when they had all these soldiers coming back from the trenches from Europe, coming back to England, and they were they had shell shock, and they, the military saw that as, it was expensive, and they wanted those soldiers to go right back to the battlefield, and so they had to find ways to treat them. So that's when a lot of modern psychiatry comes out of the treatments for shell shock, which involved, basically the same techniques of wipe the traumatic memories, and, send them back out there not remembering what happened to them, and they'll be able to function. And that's really what they were doing to people in the 50s and 60s too, in Montreal and other places. But I think you have to go to England. You have to look at England for, the real origins of these things. Freud at the Tavistock Institute in the 30s, that's where this weaponized psychiatry and the methods began to develop. And I haven't studied it in a long time, and there were the figures like Kurt Lewin, who came to the States, came to New York, I think, and I think he founded the New York Institute of Psychiatry, and then collected all these people. It was a great success story, of how they managed to find all these doctors, psychiatrists, who were willing to work for the military, and it's a military program. So they're willing to program human beings, willing to destroy them in order to recreate them and turn them, eventually, basically, into controllable robots. That would be the ideal.
Who will do anything that they say? Who will,
Yeah.
who will rage in the streets of Montreal yelling "Free, free Palestine"? Maybe something like that.
Well, I don't know about that. I have other. I don't think that's 100%, but we talk about that another time. But definitely the people breaking the windows and going on a rampage. Those are black bloc anarchist types. Those people show up at all the demonstrations, and some of them are robotic. I mean, and I've seen some of the cops are robotic these days. There's physical types, and they say there's the tall, ectomorphic type of RCMP, but then there's these sort of foot soldiers that are like short and, husky, and they are kind of mentally, I don't know, primitive.
What did we see
and
during the Freedom Convoy, right? Like, I have heard so many people who've come on this show who were there on the last couple of days when they sent the cops out to kettle the protesters, and people who were right there on that very front line. And just the other week, I had a guy on telling me he laid down in front of them, and he looked up, and he tried to get them to talk. They wouldn't answer him. They wouldn't look at him. They stood there like they were on pause or something, or they needed to be wound up again.
They were soldiers, or they were police?
Well, we don't know, because they had masks on and unidentifiable uniforms with no insignia. So, and there's still a lot of people don't know who these guys were.
Yes, and some people said they were UN troops or something. They flew in on planes, and
yeah, some people were saying that. So I don't know. I mean, were these guys programmed? Were they a bunch of Manchurian candidates? I mean, that, if you extrapolate from what they tried to do with MK Ultra, which was a program, like, as you say, lasted for 20 years almost, in over 150 locations across the United States alone, here in Canada as well, in Montreal. I mean, like, what have they done since then?
Because most people who study it say it never ended. They covered it up. They folded it, they folded it up, and they tried to put it away, but it was ongoing. And then they claimed, well, it didn't really work. It was a failure. We found out we couldn't hypnotize people and mind control them. They absolutely could, but they don't admit it. Or we couldn't get people, train them to be remote viewers and so on. Yes, they could. Yes, they did.
Remote viewing is something interesting that we've heard talked about on Art Bell, overnight with Art Bell. Like, he's talked about that for years. Like, what is that exactly? Is that like being able to step out of your body and see something that's happening hundreds of miles away?
Yes, I think so. We can all
Wow.
do it, supposedly. You know, it's something that people innately are capable of, but some people seem to have a special ability. I had a team spontaneously. They grew up, and they came to me, um, and they were all capable of doing that. I watched them at it. I mean, it was incredible to see them. And some of my Cold War parts, there's a part of my Cold War which is really about that experience. People have a hard time accepting it. And if you don't actually witness it, you know, you might say, well, this is a hoax. They were faking, you know, but since I witnessed it and I know it was completely genuine, they had no previous information when they just took off, and they would bring back, they would go places and see things and talk to people and bring back the information. And I videotaped one of the sessions, or I had someone with me who videotaped it.
So
And
what
it's
does
on
it look
record
like?
what
Their
happened.
bodies just go limp, and then
Not
they're
really limp, no, they just sit there, but somehow something detaches, you know, they have this medium mystic ability. And I swear they didn't even really know one another. There were about a dozen of these people in a room that someone had brought together. They'd come to take a course with him, and that's why he had them all there. And he said, I'm gonna bring you to meet them, and I'll get them to, you know, we'll experiment. We'll see if they can help you. This was quite early at the beginning of my book, research and writing of my book. So you
wow.
asked, you know, where do my memories come from? I have certain memories. I have thousands of pages of research that I've read, you know, documents that were available then. Whoops.
No, I'm just
For the book, right?
throwing your book up
Yeah,
there again. Yeah, on the
yeah. So
website
back in 2003,
standbymee.ca.
yeah. So it started with research. I had internet, and I had unlimited time, and I just read. I'd read 12 hours a day, you know, and I'd read MK Ultra, about MK Ultra. This was, you know, like at the beginning. And I had reasons to think that I'd been somehow involved, but I didn't know how. But then a year later, I was back in Montreal, and I met a psychic named Harley, who immediately started saying, well, your father is here. It was at a fair, a very noisy place. And I just decided to go to this psychic fair and met him. There he was, not the person I was looking for. He said, your father's here. He's telling me he has a story he must tell you. You know, I will give you 2 hours of my time. Come to my office, and we will get your father's story. I mean, he didn't know me. He didn't know. And then so I went to his office. Um, and I hadn't heard from my father had died 30 years earlier. He said, your father's been dead for 30 years, but this is his time now to tell the story, and we're going to get it, you know, where he's going to tell you now. So he started just pouring out these details, including things like the name of my father's best friend, and people's names, dates, you know, facts. I mean, he didn't know me from a hole in the ground. I had never met him
Yeah.
before, and some of the stuff I actually had to go and ask my brother, what was Dad's best friend's name? Yeah, you know, Steve, you know, whatever. And to me, totally genuine. And then he said, I think to anyone, you would have gone, wow, I must follow up on this. So he said, come to this group, and I have these people. They're all very gifted, and we'll see what will happen. I went in, and all I said was, well, I'm trying to write a book, and I think it's about Nazis and when I was a kid, and I was really like, I had nothing. I didn't even know why I was there. You know, I mean, what to say to them? I told them nothing. And they said okay, and they went into a meditation, and then all of a sudden they were in a room at McGill. It was 1960, and there were children, and one by one, first they went to the party, and they described what was going on at the party, including there was a little girl who had a polio brace on a table, and she was dead. And the other children were standing around looking at her. She had died. And that was one of the first things that they saw. And then they saw the games and what the symbols were. They named all the symbols on the cards that the children had to guess. And then some of the rough games that were going on, and they just described this. And then they spoke to a couple of the children and got the full story of why they were there, what brought them, who they were, and and what happened later to these kids. So I wrote it all down, and then the following another meeting we had, we went to the laboratory, and there were about 10 kids living in the laboratory underground at McGill, and they all had names, and each one of them told us. It was like we were interviewing, who are you and why are you here? And there was one little girl, the first girl she was tied to a chair with electrodes in her head, coming out of her head, tied to a machine. And we said, how long have you been there? She said, I don't know, it's been years. And when I need to pee, I just pee. She couldn't leave the chair. And she was 16 years old. She told us her mother's name. I looked her up. There were several other kids who told equally her, all kinds of things happened. Later, I got 2 of the names. I went down to the archives of the city of Montreal, and I found both of them in the archives.
Wow.
And with the proper dates, those dates. So you could say that with psychic research, but you could have all kinds of experiences on the psychic plane. You can't prove it. You can't prove any of it. You can have a vivid story. But in this case, there were some things that I was able to verify with research.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you can verify them, then I suppose you can explain it. I don't know how they did it, but you know what I mean? But this is the research I did. They were right. How is that even possible unless they're telling the truth that they were there?
Yeah.
Because they did remote viewing. Let me ask you, Anne. Oh, go ahead.
No, that's it. I just thank you. Yeah, thank you for getting it.
Sure. I want to talk about Leonard Cohen. And what you told me was very interesting earlier today when we were talking about him kind of appearing at places where there was going to be an event, a major event. And one of them was the shooting of John Lennon. Because we had heard, and I ran one piece on my website last week, that Mark David Chapman was a stooge or somebody under MK Ultra mind control who did it. Because when he's questioned later, he doesn't know why he did it. He didn't hate John Lennon. It had nothing to do with that book, The Catcher in the Rye. He liked John Lennon. He got an autograph from John Lennon on his latest album that afternoon. And then he shoots him 5 times, and he can't explain why. Like, what? But Leonard Cohen was there, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was. Well, here's another story.
Can you tell that story, please? I mean, that's such an interesting story that I think people want to hear that.
Well, I can't do justice to the, in an interview like this, really, to the intricacies, but it was over.
Go ahead. Take your time. Take your time. I mean, you know what, guys? Once again tonight, we're going to go long, just like we did last night. But I find this stuff fascinating, and you've got stories.
You can't edit. You can edit it, right? Later, no, I know you can't really.
There's 1,500 people watching us right now. They were here. They want to hear it.
Hi. Oh my, that many. Now I have stage fright. No. Oh, okay. No, I can tell it. I've told it many times. I wrote a memoir called The Man Next Door, Leonard Cohen, The Man Next Door. When I got to the end, that's when I realized that, yeah, he likely, well, whatever. that when I got to the very end of the book, that's when I realized what I had just not proven, but I'd basically told it. Okay, okay. To sum it up, because I was 29 years old in 1980, and I had gotten a grant to write a novel. You could say I was a young, Canadian writer. And I scored a Canada Council grant, and I had $9,000. So I decided to take it to Greece and live on the island of Hydra for the winter, thinking it would be lovely, but warm and pleasant. But actually, it was the worst winter of my life. But in any case, I was there. And there's more to the story, because it really started in Tel Aviv at the end of November, when I'd been traveling in Egypt a bit, gone from Greece, started getting cold in November. So I went down to Egypt, and I wanted to see the pyramids and so on. And then I said, okay, Leonard's giving a concert in Tel Aviv at the end of November. I'll go to the concert. In fact, I'll meet him at the airport, because I knew him. I had already known him for a few years at that point, and he liked me, and we got on well. So I met the plane, and then joined got on the bus with the band and Leonard, and went to the hotel in Tel Aviv, and then at the end, at the end of the concert, a couple of days later, I said, well, I'm going to Greece. I'm going to spend the winter on Hydra. He said, oh, that's an interesting idea. And the next thing I know, he was on Hydra. And in his house, and he said, his kids were coming for Christmas, Hanukkah. It was the end of November, starting to be cold and rainy, and I saw him a few times, and then there was a period we had kind of a little something happened, and I didn't see him for about 10 days, 2 weeks, and then in the middle of December, I saw him getting off. I saw him with his family, his children, and the nanny. He was separated from his wife, but they were arriving on the island of Hydra. It's an island near Athens that's accessible by boat and by hydrofoil and so on, and about 2 hours from Athens. And so since the last time I'd seen him, he had lost about 10 pounds. He was gaunt. He had grown a beard, and he looked like he was coming from a war zone, really. And I didn't know. Okay. So that was on December 14th, 1980, 6 days after John Lennon was shot. And I had been on the island since the end of November, and I started trying to write my novel, because I thought, I've got to get this written, I've got to start work, got to get down to business. So I'd been in my room for about 10 days. It had been raining, and I hadn't seen Leonard in those 10 days, but so I'd seen him on the night of December 5th. Okay. John Lennon was shot on December 8th. And so I heard about that. Everybody was in shock. I didn't try to see Leonard because I was feeling a little embarrassed about something that had happened. So it's the last time I'd seen him. So I waited to run into him. And then that day I was walking through the port. There he was, getting off the hydrofoil with his family and ready to spend Christmas, and looking awful. Okay. Where can I say? I said, isn't it awful about what happened to John Lennon? Later, when I saw him for coffee, a couple of days later, he was carrying a copy of the Newsweek magazine that said, Lennon's in, Lennon's out, Reagan's in. And he shows me this Newsweek, and he's obviously totally in love with Ronald Reagan. I said, isn't it awful about John Lennon? He said, I never liked the Beatles. And then end of conversation. He didn't discuss it any further. Okay, just keep it in mind. That's what happened within a week or two of John Lennon's death. And I saw him another time. There was, well, to tell you the truth, there was a pistol on the table in his house when I visited him. And I said, what's that doing here? It was like a Smith & Wesson or something, a Glock. I don't know what it was on the table. I'd never seen
Leonard Cohen. He never struck me as a gun guy.
Right? No, and me neither.
He's a poet.
He said, well, everyone's going to have one of these. He says, we're all going to need to he was teaching his children how to shoot. They were like 6 and 4 or something at the time. No, 6 and 8. The girl was 6, the boy was 8. So he was teaching them, giving them target practice in the garden. And he said, I'm teaching them to use a gun because we're all going to need, in the future. His view was where it's going to be war. And I was pretty, I don't know, I was just kind of disgusted in a way, I said, if you think that way, it'll happen, but anyway, years go by. Let me see how to tell. Finished. I want to wrap this up. Years go by, and biography comes out on Leonard Cohen. It's like 1995. So 15 years have passed. And I'm asked to review this biography because I knew him. So I knew some people, anyway, at the local entertainment paper, they just wanted a quick little review. Well, I start going through the biography and I start noticing these things that seem odd. And one of the things I noticed, like this, that are incorrect, like I thought, look, I didn't research this very well because this is wrong. And here's something that's definitely wrong. It says that Leonard Cohen was in New York on December 11th, 1980. No, he was on Hydra in December of 1980. He was there the whole month. I saw him. Lots of people saw him, and this is incorrect, but it was written on it. It was a piece of hotel stationery where he, from New York, the Algonquin Hotel in Manhattan, and he had started writing a song on that stationery, and it was, so it was part of this, the collection of papers that you hand over to biographers, I guess, when you give them stacks of things to go through, and they found that. And I said, that's impossible. And I wrote a review. I said, this biography is full of mistakes. And here's a really big one. Leonard wasn't in New York. He never talked. And not only that, he never said he was in New York. He never said, I went off to New York and came back. But what had to have happened was I saw him on the 5th, and then I saw him on the 14th. I saw him as he was leaving for New York, but I didn't know he was leaving for New York at the time. And I saw him as he was coming back from New York. And he never said, I was in New York when John Lennon was shot. How can that be? But in fact, the second biography came out a few years later, and the same fact, hotels, Algonquin Hotel, December 11th, 1980. He's celebrating Hanukkah. He says that he's writing that he's celebrating Hanukkah with his kids. Well, December 11th, Hanukkah was already over. And that was some kind of alibi. So all to say, how can I make this? The biggest thing is that I saw him so many times over that winter, and I knew many people who saw him, and there was not one person who ever said, Leonard was in New York when John Lennon was shot. Did you hear? Because he never told a soul that he'd been in New York. How
But
does that?
There was other situations where he was at the epicenter of other things that happened in the world, and he happened to be there, but nobody knew it until later, right?
Because each one of these events that he went to, they were ops, or call them, I guess, missions, or they were things that were planned, like the assassination of John Lennon had to have been planned. I mean,
Yeah.
You can even see that if you just follow Mark David Chapman's travels and so on. You can see that he was building up to that for over a year. He sort of knew he was, I think he was offered the chance to be the assassin, and he couldn't quite live up to it. And when it came down to it, there's a new book that I saw recent that has been out for a while by David Whalen, and it's called
The Assassination of John Lennon. Yeah.
It's called Mind Games, maybe. I'm not sure, but anyway,
The Assassination of John Lennon is what, and he looks into that situation very thoroughly. And he said Mark David Chapman either was under mind control, or he couldn't have acted alone, or maybe it was both. But getting back to Leonard Cohen for a second.
The bullet came from the wrong direction for it to have been, for example, he was shot through, I forget, it was the front or the back and at a certain angle. And Chapman wasn't nowhere near that, nowhere able to shoot those bullets.
Plus,
even if he shot his gun.
In that situation with Lennon, there's no actual eyewitness who's ever come out and said, I saw John Lennon get shot, even though they say there were tons of people all over the place when he was getting out of the car that night. So, and Yoko has never said it.
Okay. Right, exactly. Yoka's sort of fudged on a number of things. She hasn't been, yeah, she told a story about it, about how she broke down. And anyway, I think Whalen's book is really excellent. Whalen said there's an eyewitness, and the thing is, I told my long involved story about why it makes no sense that Leonard, he provably, it seems, in New York during the week that Lennon was shot. How could you make that trip, come back to this island where you plan to spend the next 6 months or a year? Basically he was there to hide or cool off and get back to normal, having, in my opinion, having been part of that operation in New York, but never saying a word, to anyone about it. How could you have been there by accident, and just went to New York and just happened that Lennon was shot that week? But that's one thing that might happen, but the biographies lie about it, and they say they actually say he went to New York and then he stayed in America all that year. So there's been the actual creation of a fake story it's in the biographies, where they claim he was in North America, kind of doing not much of anything. I'm talking about Leonard now, right? But actually he was on Hydra almost the entire year. I saw him multiple times, and there are other witnesses, but that was erased because that was his getaway, his alibi. Being on Hydra was a place to cool off and to hide out. But you
Sure.
wouldn't want anyone to know that you went to New York on December 5th and then came back on the 14th and never told anybody you'd been in New York. You'd never
So
want that story to be known, right? So
was Leonard was he MK Ultra?
yeah, absolutely. I think he was a
And you
successful Manchurian candidate. I think he was one of the few. I think most of the people they tried to program became schizophrenic or psychotic or whatever, broke down and committed suicide. And generally, you cannot take a person and program them and turn them into a killer or a hypnotic, whatever, hypnotized robot. It usually doesn't work. But I think in his case, he had incredible mental strength and imagination and capacities, that most people don't have. And he actually, I believe, became what they wanted him to be. But he also maintained this vast kind of consciousness that, he was a very unusual human being with who was very aware of the program, of what was going on, but just didn't tell people. You asked a
and
question earlier that I
no, go ahead.
avoided. I
Yeah.
forget now. It's back in a few minutes ago. You asked me something, and I went back to repeating my story about Hydra, but and why I think that I don't know. I can't remember now.
I was just asking why you believe this. I mean, I know you spent time with him, but you made fun at the beginning of the show tonight when you said, "Yeah, I think I was every girl in Montreal dated Leonard Cohen." All right, but you spent time with him. Did he
Yeah.
show? Did he show the behavior of somebody who had been altered?
Yeah. Well, he definitely had a high level that I've never seen in anyone else, maybe one or two other people, but who were also in that program, of ESP. Like he really could I won't say numerous times, but I can think of several times he actually read my mind and spoke my thought to me. For example, a thought suddenly came into my mind out of nowhere, and then he spoke it. I saw that. We would watch TV, and he would anticipate the dialogue just consistently. He could go on and on and on, anticipating the next line of dialogue in the show, word for word. He had, and I was told by other people that he had the ability to like hold up a card and guess that, someone told me that on Hydra. Someone who knew him said they found a playing card on the ground, and Leonard said, "Hold it up, put it on your forehead, and I will guess it." And he did, and he got it, and that's sort of a lot of people, I think, saw him doing those kinds of things. He had also he had a deep interest in violence, and I'm not saying he was ever violent with me, but he wasn't. He was actually mostly very, very nice to me. But and very understanding and parental almost, but I've heard he was violent with other women. Yeah, so people told me, so he would say multiple personalities
That's
for sure.
wild. That's wild. And if they can do that, what else can they do? What else can they do
Mhm.
to people?
That's what they aimed to
There's a
do was, yeah,
there's a book, it's called Carry on Comfort. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of it. You said you read a
no,
lot, so I thought I'd throw it out there. It's by a guy called Dan Simmons. It's a work of fiction. And it talks about this small cabal of people who secretly control the world, but they have the ability to control other people through their minds. And it's a terrible, terrible book. Great book, great story, but a terrible book, if you know what I mean. It's almost like you're offended reading it because of the things that these people do. Imagine having that kind of power where you could actually go into somebody else's body and control them like a puppet, which is what these characters in this book do. What kind of a person would that be? Would that person be human at that stage of the game? We talk about the rich, the elite, the people who apparently feed off something called adrenochrome. And yes, YouTube algorithms, there is, in fact, a substance that is called adrenochrome. These people live a different plane of existence than the rest of us do, right? They don't have to go shopping every day. They're not bothered by the day-to-day naggings of the rest of the world, the useless eaters out there. These people, they live above us in the clouds almost. What kind of people would these be? And what would they be capable of? Right? These are the kinds of people who might think, hey, I'm going to grab somebody off the street and put them in a mind control experiment. Or I'm going to go and get a little girl who's 4 or 5 years old and put her in a mind control experiment for 10 or 12 years just to see what happens.
well, I think that's the mentality is a psychopathic, uh, heartless, no limits, kind of mentality that drives these people. The people that are drawn to these kinds of professions or whatever they are, and people who go into the military or people who go into into government. They say, it's the sociopaths who rise to the top. It's the people that who seize control of organizations are these kinds of people, cold, calculating, but also maybe people who will follow orders too. I mean, I don't like the rich very much. I've had minimal kind of experience with them, but one place, was this Greek island, Hydra. There were quite a lot of millionaires and various kinds of people lived there with backgrounds, in these. They weren't the high level people, but they had money and they were idle. And really, I hated the atmosphere. I just don't want to be with people like that. But
Why
obviously,
would you?
there are people who, yeah,
They're psychopaths. I mean, we heard about that a little bit. Annaka Lucas talked about that. Some of the people she named names in that interview she did with Patrick Bet David. David, we're talking about the
yeah.
ultra rich. If you got $10 million, whatever. I'm talking about the power to buy an island or live in an aircraft that never has to land. Like that's the kind of wealthy that we're talking about. Rockefeller, de Rothschild, Gates, Musk, people with that kind of money who never, ever, ever have to see what real life is like. They've never ridden on a bus. They've never shopped for groceries. They have never done anything like that. Their only intention is to improve the world.
Well, they're not improving it. They're turning it into a hell. you know, but I
From
don't
their
know. I mean,
perspective, right, is what I'm saying, is from their perspective. I'm like, they believe that their only purpose in life is to improve the world. It's they feel like that's their calling. That's what they were born for.
yeah,
And they
delusional.
don't feel they're
It's
doing
so.
evil. Yeah, they're delusional. You're right. You're right.
But they, I guess they do have a plan. I would like you. I think of them as another species almost. They're not. Um, and I'm definitely not drawn to being around them. I think they're monsters essentially. And I don't discount the reptilian cons- conspiracy either, because actually I have a sense that they are of different of a different race or species, from average humans who have other reasons. We humans have reasons for being here that these entities have never, they don't consider. They're not
It
driven by.
it's all very
Yeah.
interesting, but we start talking about the MK Ultra experiments that you were a part of. And then you start to think, well, what were they doing this for? What were they trying to achieve? Did they accomplish what they wanted? Are they still going on? What people out there are the results of these experiments? What exactly is Klaus Schwab from the World Economic Forum talking about when he talks about the young global leaders and we have penetrated the cabinets? What exactly does that mean? The guy sounds like a Bond villain. We all joke about it, but who's to say that all of
I,
these people that he deals with aren't under some kind of control? Macron in France and Starmer in the UK and Joe Biden. I mean, who knows what was going on with that guy for the last 4 years? Maybe they took his implants out in the last year or something, and he was unable to think.
it's become, yeah, leaders of the world are completely, they're completely controlled, it seems. It's surreal what we're witnessing, and we're just being conditioned to accept it as normal. There's
Yeah,
nothing normal about it. And these people
yeah,
are all unelected, basically. Either they're just put in these positions like Schwab. I don't know how he got what is that? The World Economic Forum. I mean, who created that? It's an NGO or something. It's completely independent of any sort of, yeah, and yet it want any public, oversight, and yet they want to completely transform humanity. I mean,
yeah,
where
yeah.
did
Like
these
their
people come
mission
from?
is to
Dr.
change
Evil.
the world. Come on, are you kidding me? Right? Like, well, we're transforming. Nobody asked you to do that. Hey, did you watch, Anne, did you watch all of Annaka Lucas's interview?
Almost all of it. I did. I kind of trailed off at the end. So I don't know if I forget now what she was getting into, but I was, anyway, I stopped at a certain point
Well,
toward,
it was
the
pretty
last 20
combative.
minutes.
It got pretty combative because he wanted her to name names and she wanted to talk more about the healing process. And I want to talk about that with you in a couple of minutes. But what was your take on some of the things that she said? I mean, and her experiences.
Oh, I've listened to a few of her interviews, and I think she's uh, extremely articulate, and she has really worked on this on this subject, and worked on herself, and it's really given her a language to describe the process. I think she's absolutely brilliant, in what she has to share. And to me, it seems completely real, and it seems also all based on her having had this very, strange, what is the word? Her childhood, this horrible childhood, very, I mean, like I said, did I say it? Each story is different. Yeah.
Mhm.
Each story of each child getting into these programs would be there for it would be slightly different in each case, depending on the parent. So in her case, she had a certain type of mother who was the reason, and I think also Annaka has a certain personality, which I think is a star performer. I think she was maybe born to be what they saw in her, what they saw her becoming, a singer and a kind of sex symbol and a performer. She had all that in her, and I think that's why she was singled out for particularly bad treatment too. Like because she disappointed them. Um, uh, someone else that might not have gone as far into it as she went, because she had the qualities, of a. So I find her completely believable. I mean, to me, there's no question. It doesn't even occur to me to not believe her.
Brave.
And
Absolutely
yeah,
brave. When did you first find out,
yeah.
Anne, that you had been part of these experiments? Did you when you were part of them, did you even realize it? Because you mentioned earlier that you just thought it was normal. And when you were first started, you were just turning 5. Of course, you would think that it's normal, right? Like everybody does it.
Well,
Did you?
the thing is, I
When
had,
did you?
yeah, she talked about that a bit too. I think she talked about how she had no idea she was part of anything, and then the memories began coming. They
Mhm.
began flooding. Well, I have not done a therapy to the extent that she's done it, and I have not. I have been warned not to get hypnotized about this, and to look into what really happened to me. So in some ways, I'm a timid. I guess I'm more timid. What I've done is I have studied around it, but to begin with, I researched MK Ultra like for a year. I couldn't stop. I was so riveted to this information. I would read, like I said, 12 hours a day, um, just documents, just taking it all in, and then corresponding with some of the survivors. But I didn't yet understand that I had been in it. I knew that my family had been, because from the very outset of when I first asked the question, I started with a question I asked myself one day in 2000 to 2002. I said, I'd read a book about the denazification of Nazi Germany. It was called I forget the Good Nazi or something. I forget what it was called. But anyway, it was a novel, and about getting Operation Paperclip, how it began in Berlin when they were looking for Nazi scientists and recruiting them and taking them to America. So it was a book about that. And suddenly I asked myself, I wonder if Dr. Mengele ever worked for the CIA. And I had been to Auschwitz that same summer. In June, I spent a month in Poland, or a few weeks in Poland, and I've been to Auschwitz, and I went to Mengele's clinic, and I had this kind of, some kind of fixation about Mengele. It's a whole story in itself. So I had this question about Mengele, Dr. Mengele. Okay, he's like very important to the MK Ultra story,
Yep.
because they used his methods that are called trauma-based mind control as the basis for a lot of what they were doing. The he would he would torture children in his clinic in Auschwitz, twins and so on. He liked twins, but other children too, and he tortured them to the point of death almost. And the following day, they would have no memory of it, and they would call him daddy, and they would love him. And he was an expert in what, with trauma, you can erase memory. If you traumatize somebody enough, they won't remember what you've done to them. This is incredible. This is, it's counterintuitive. It's very hard for people to realize that, but that's, I would say, yeah, the basis of the whole thing is you forget horror, especially if it's real and happens to you. So I asked this question: did Mengele ever work for the CIA? And I Googled it. And the first thing that came up, for some reason that I have no idea, 1962, Montreal, Dr. Ewan Cameron, McGill University, Allen Memorial. And then there was some article of it, some Mengele somehow was mixed into this. So I couldn't believe it, because 1962, that's when my father went into the Allen Memorial of McGill University in Montreal, and I had been thinking about him a lot too, like what happened to my father? What was that all about? So that's how I started the research. It still took me, and I'll tell you, it was at least a year or two. It was when I met that group that I told you about, the remote viewers, and when they began pulling in these children. And by the way, I can send you the script of that if you ever want to read it, because it's word for word what happened, right? What they said, what they told us. It's totally amazing. It's it's a play. It's a, dramatic, whatever, uh, scenario. And you can read it and you can judge for yourself. Is this real? you know. But it was only when I went through that, and I was with them for a couple of years, and slowly I began saying things to me, like I'd be sitting next to somebody and he would turn to me and say, just somebody I had never met before who happened to be there in the group that night, and he'd say, there's a man here, he wants, he's trying to give you a message. And he was seeing this man on the spiritual plane. I wasn't experiencing anything. And he said, his name is, and he said, he said, you used to know him. He was your psychiatrist. You called him Dolan, but his real name is Nolan. So, and he's very sorry for what he did to you as a child. And he was kind of obliged to do it, or that's what everybody was doing. And now he's paying the price. He's in the next world, and he's paying a price for that, for what he did to children. So I take all this in, I go home, and I Google around, and I find instantly Dr. Nolan D.C. Lewis, colleague of, Cameron, from the New York Institute of Psychiatry of Columbia University in the year and so on. And I look at his dates and what he did. Later, a couple of years later, a German researcher contacts me and asks, because I put it in my book, I put his name in there, and somebody Googles and finds my book, and he's done a PhD thesis on Dr. Nolan Lewis and confirms everything, and and where he was and what he did. And he was absolutely, a psychoanalyst working for the military. So where am I? What's the question? So that's how
When did you realize
that's how I approached it.
Yeah. The question
and
was
so
like, when did you?
So for me, it was almost an intellectual process. I was warned, do not get hypnotized by people who had a spouse or someone they knew or had done it themselves. They'd been hypnotized about their MK Ultra memories from childhood, and that was the end of them. They were completely disabled by the flooding was completely debilitating. They spent all their waking hours and sleeping hours remembering horrible things that were done. And I was told, don't do it. You're functioning. You're okay. You have memory walls. You have, you've had a life, is what, up to now. Some people are so damaged by those experiments, they need to go through that therapy process, just in order to live. But in the end, they can end up on drugs, disability, all kinds of stuff, diagnosed as psychotic or whatever, because they've done that work. It's a risk, and it's a huge investment. So early on, it's as though I was being told, approach it at your own speed and from the outside, as a journalist rather than a victim. And so slowly, but then slowly, the inside and the outside start to meet. I mean, I had my own memories and subjective, experiences and so on. Plus I had people that I knew. That's the whole thing, is that it seems I was with a group of children. Most of them died. I was a weekend child, or I would come after school. I was coming and going. They were stuck in there, and most of them, they didn't get out because they would have been a danger, a threat to McGill, to the scientists, right? They would have been able to report. But I was being mind controlled, memory wiped, and taken home, and I didn't know where I'd been. This is what I believe. This is what I've put together about my life. And that there's a huge gaps in, like I missed 100 days of school in grade 2, exactly 100 days, 100 days out of 200. And I still, got top marks and, 7 years old, praise from the teacher and so on. But I mean, I wasn't in school. They were taking me out. And that's when I probably spent quite a bit of time with Leonard Cohen downtown, because he seemed to remember me from as a child. He spoke to me as if he remembered me as a child. He called me Wee Annie, and various kinds of jokes he would make.
Interesting.
So trying to see whether I remembered.
Do you remember him from childhood?
No, this is another thing. No, I remember seeing him for the first time on television when I was 15. And he was singing the Stranger song, and it's absolutely imprinted in me, that performance on Canadian television. And after that, I was very interested in him, and I bought his books, and I later bought a record and so on, and then I met him. I began seeing him in the streets in Montreal. He would be wandering, he'd be in the streets, and he'd often greet me, or he didn't know who I was, but I was just a girl, and he talked to girls, and I was tall, and he liked tall girls or something. But no, and then when I met him, he phoned me up one night. He got my phone number from someone, and um, and I went to see him this is 1977, and I was 26, and he played a song on his guitar. He greeted me. He made tea. He entered kind of, it was very entertaining. He was very friendly. And I looking back, I think he was trying to see if I remembered him, but I didn't really. I didn't have those memories.
I wonder if
But
he was playing a certain song on his guitar that may have been a trigger for you to
yeah,
remember that. And it
yeah.
didn't work.
He,
Huh.
well, he played. He pulled out his guitar, and I said, "Oh, he's going to play Joan of Arc," because that was the song I most maybe identified with. I think he's going to play Joan of Arc, but no, he didn't. He played Red River Valley, this cowboy song, and I knew all the words, and I sang along. But when I think back, I think, you see, it is known that he used to be at the Allen Memorial. I mean, many people have told me, and I don't know if it's written down, but he would be there smoking with his friends. There were some other poets. They were in there. They were schizophrenic, or they were being treated for they were experimental subjects, basically. And they'd sit in the common room smoking cigarettes. He'd have his guitar, and they'd sing cowboy songs. And one of the first songs that one of the songs he used to play was Red River Valley. And I knew all the words. I mean, I don't know when I learned that song. I could have learned it at any point in my life. But when he started to play it, I sang along. And I think it's again, I don't know, but it's quite likely that as a little girl, I would wander into the, into the common room, sit down and listen to them play and sing along, and during one of my times away from school, when I was meeting mental patients and being whatever they were doing to me. Apparently, I was a personality there as a little girl, and I was a fixture, because friends of Leonard told that I met. It's like they spoke to me as if they remembered me as a little girl also, and I remember that made no sense at the time. This is later in life when I met these people, but they oh, Annie, and oh yeah, and they'd sort of say things that suggested the relationship had a history. Well, I thought I was meeting them for the first time as
And
adults.
it's interesting. We all have things we can't remember. Everybody does. But you have got major gaps, probably still, unless somebody can fill them in for you. And the older we get, the less likely we're going to be able to find out what happened, because those people aren't around anymore. Are you angry about
True.
that you
No.
have had part of your life taken away, or is that like ancient memory now?
Okay, well, that's a really good question. How do I? Yeah. No, I frankly, I feel I got off really easy. I even in some ways benefited from this experience I had. I'm not trying to say it was a good experience or that I'm not damaged, because I think I'm quite damaged. I mean, I've sensed that I've had trouble in relationships for most of my life, but it's getting better, and um, fears and all kinds of strange things. And I have this. Apparently I have some of the tics and behaviors of someone who was sexually abused as a child. I've been told that, by people who are familiar with it. So I'm not trying to say it's fun and games or anything, but I think that in some ways I was spared some of the worst stuff. Partly because, all right, number one, my parents were not Satanists; they were good people. So I was raised in a kind of a decent well, I'd say Christian home. You know, my parents were of opposite religions, of Protestant versus Catholic. There was a lot of arguing too that went on, but basically, I was not raised by Satanists, which is true of a lot of the people who have been through these experiments. My parents were more unwitting and maybe blackmailed, and then they regretted. They sensed that something was wrong, and they tried to rescue me and get me out when I was around 12. And something, you know, things were offered to me. I was always kind of, what's the word? Singled out at times for special, I don't know, like they would send me to UN conferences to represent my school, or they made me the editor of the school paper. And then I went to university and they put me in this special creative writing program, you know, because, and then I became the news editor of the university paper, and well, these, I had kind of in some ways there's a slightly a fairy tale element to my life. Then I started meeting people like Leonard Cohen, and he immediately pulls me into his life and adopts me almost, you know. And so there are aspects that are a little bit like Snow White, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, you know. I mean, some kind of fairy tale princess aspect to my life. And then there's a lot of loneliness, a lot of isolation, and a lot of you know. So and being weird and borderline, you know, some people thinking I'm completely nuts, you know, and it's not wanting anything to do with me. Different things have happened, you know. It's been a bumpy kind of life. Which I don't regret, because I think I would have been bored by another type of life. So, you know, and now the funny thing is I'm 73 at this point. I mean, it's like getting up there. In the last 5 years, I've started to have some connections with a whole other side of this program that I think was part of it, and that was wiped from my memory. And it had to do with the music business, and it had to do with the Rolling Stones. And I've met their manager, you know, their first manager, and I'm in the process of writing a whole story of that. But that's kind of fun in a way. But just to say, I believe that all of these bands, all of the music of the 60s, one way or another, fell under the umbrella of the mind control programming of the time, including the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, you know, the Dave Clark Five, the whole, all of them, Donovan, you know, all these people.
The British invasion, for goodness sakes. They say the British invasion was completely manufactured as a mass test on the people of America. Yeah. Can we get them? Because they'd already seen it with Elvis, right? You know, the King. And so they thought, can we do this again? So they kill the president. And then a month and a half later, the Beatles arrive when the country is completely and totally demoralized. And then everything changes.
You got it. It's true. It's exactly what happened. That was exactly, you know, how old are you? Oh, you don't want to
59.
say?
No, I don't care.
Oh,
59.
Yeah. So you kind of you came in just as Kennedy was assassinated.
No, I was a couple years after.
A little bit later.
Yeah.
You were what? Yeah.
I was a couple years after. Yeah.
So I was kind of the generation maybe most programmed in some ways, because I just kind of, you know, I was 12 when Kennedy was assassinated, you know, and it's like 13 when the Beatles came, 14 when the Rolling Stones came, you know. And
so you lived through all of that. You saw people lose their minds about the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and did it surprise you that people would just go crazy like that? Because that's what it was. Like, they were nuts.
Oh,
and
I don't know. No.
Today with Taylor Swift. I mean, look at Justin Trudeau dancing at that show the other night. He looked like an idiot.
I don't know. That's where his programming really came out again. I don't know what kind of. I know. It's been a very strange week for Justin Trudeau.
His programming.
No.
Jordan Peterson calls him Peter Pan. And when you see
that's
that,
what
you know, He's exchanging friendship bracelets with teenage girls. He's partying with teenage girls, 15-year-olds, understanding that he's got a daughter who's that age. But if I had a daughter who was that age and I had to go to a Taylor Swift show, I don't think I'd be dancing so enthusiastically with her and all of her friends so everybody could see. I mean, I might go, once and then sit down and just try and struggle my way through the show, but he was right into it, which seems strange for a 53-year-old.
53 is how old he is. That's right. He looked like he was out of his mind, and I would guess he was in an alter. He was in a sub-personality of someone that age. But that would be just my flippant, theory, whatever. But It looked like it to me that he was not in his own. He was not the Justin, that. And I think that's typical. I have having multiple personalities, which I may have, by the way, but I'm not that. As I say, I haven't seen a professional and a therapist. I've never seen a therapist, really. I've just done my thing. But I probably do have alters. I had an alter, I believe, that was flown to London at age 12, 1963 again in June, and then I attended that I stayed with the Rolling Stones in London in 1963 for a short time, like maybe a weekend or less. I was flown there and flown back.
You feel like you did, or an altered
well, that's it. I can't prove. I can't prove it, but I met the manager of the Rolling Stones, and he gave a course at the university where I was teaching at one point, and it's a whole thing. A whole thing has happened that has changed my. But and I've had a long-term relationship, but I won't with Mick Jagger. I mean, over the internet, and different things have happened, which was arranged by other people. So there's a whole story, another whole story there, but it seems as though as an alter, like a 12-year-old, I was I think put in a crate, loaded onto a plane, flown to London, removed from the crate, and then transported to the Stones' apartment. Well, they weren't the Stones; they were barely the Stones at that point. I mean, nobody knew them. They were just these guys. And I woke up in the apartment. And I had
we haven't even gotten into
and they weren't even known. They didn't have a record out yet. But that day, that was the weekend they launched their first, like 45, their first and that got onto the hit parade in England. And I have a very detailed memory of being there. And I checked. It came back to me only 2-3 years ago, just as a dream. But and then I just checked some of the details in the dream, like what the temperature was in London that day. And I saw certain details. What was I wearing? Where did we go? What happened on that day? And all of it lines up with, like it happened to be very hot in London, and it was 25. In my dream, it was 25 degrees Celsius, and then I looked it up on the internet. Yeah, for 2 days that month, there were 2 hot days in an otherwise cool and rainy month, and it was those 2 days, and it was 25 degrees, and and so on, and a whole series of things happened. And then I was flown back home, and my memory was wiped to the whole experience. I never knew.
You should get those remote viewer guys to look at that one. Are they still around?
Yeah,
those remote?
Yeah. Well, that would be like, anyway, I just report that. It's like something that happened to me that I think as an alter. And I think also I was pretending to be older than I was. I was 12, but I think I was trying to pass myself off as 16 or 18 or something. And there was a whole.
You have this feeling that this happened, or is it?
It's more. It's not. It's more than a feeling. It's a very what's the word? Very detailed, recovered memory with facts that are attached to the memory that you know when you wake up, and then you can go and you can actually check those facts, like the temperature, the date of the first launch and it was that date. And what was I supposed to be doing really those days? I was supposed to be at a track and field meet with my grade 6 class in Montreal. And I spoke with a friend who I was in grade 6 with, And I said, do you remember those track and field days we would have every June? Yeah. She said, and I said, do you remember 1963? And she said, yeah, I know where we went. But she said, I have no memory. And she didn't come back with any ribbons or anything from winning. She used to win all these events at these things, but she didn't have any. She keeps all the souvenirs of her, of her
Not that
school
time.
days and so on. And she knows everything. Yeah.
Wow.
And so 1963, she said, and I said, same for me. I can remember 1962. I can remember 1964. But what did we do in 1963? She said, we went up north to Shawbridge Boys Farm. I said, yeah, I remember being told that we were going to go take a bus and go up to this place up north where we would have this track and field meet. And it's like, I almost remember getting on the bus, but I don't remember anything after. She said, same for me. I don't have any memory at all of it. I remember things that happened at the year before, the year after, but nothing. Okay. Shawbridge Boys Farm is an extension of the MK Ultra McGill. It was for juvenile delinquents, and McGill psychiatrists who ran the MK Ultra program were also running that program. So it was an extension of MK Ultra. So what I think happened, this is just to give you, like, it's a kind of, example of how they might do it. They take kids on the school bus and bring them up north, and I don't know what they do, but one of them at least gets sort of taken out of the group and put on a plane and flown to London and has a whole experience in London. And it's flown back, and then her memory, and then they wipe her memory. Oh, and I remember very clearly writing my Canadian history exam a few days later, because I do remember that June. I remember things that happened. It was quite a busy month. And I remember that once again, the voice was in my head while I was writing my exam. You're no good. You will fail. You will never succeed at anything. So I think it's quite likely that I was brought back to from this flight to London, and I don't know, child trafficking, sexual, whatever, something. And then met by the psychiatrists, debriefed and reprogrammed.
You said you
I
had
have these fragments, so I can put it together.
You said you had was it an online relationship with Jagger? Something along those lines?
Yeah. Well, it was sort of arranged that I go and meet him in the Caribbean. And I went kind of thinking, I'm not going to meet him, but I'll go. I went to the island. It was like someone was strongly encouraging me to go down there. And sure enough, he was there. He was waiting for me. He was on the beach when I arrived, waded in off the boat.
When was that?
And then a series of things happened. What?
No, when was that when you met him?
In 1992. It was, yeah.
Did he
1992,
remember you? Did he remember you from being a little kid? Like, was there something there?
I think he did. Well, he behaved like I would say in retrospect, he behaved like he knew me. But he was very nervous about it. It's a whole, that's a whole, like, something I can't get into really.
Wow.
But I think that the situation was I had no memory of ever knowing him. At that point, I just thought I was seeing him for the first time. I didn't know what he was. I kind of said, what's he doing here? Like, why is this working? It shouldn't be working. I mean, but there he was. And a whole series of sort of comedy of errors happened that day. But I think the reason he came out to meet me was he knew who I was, because he had known my family through the MK Ultra program at McGill. And he was a boy flown in from England that they were going to, that they had selected for a special future. And I think initially his future the plan was he was going to go into politics and journalism.
But then they just made him a rock star instead.
And couldn't get out of it. I think he was. But anyway, yeah, I have kind of an ongoing, I've communicated with him over 30 years, but with a lot of, I've been very slow to remember, to some of this stuff, because when you're 5 years old, say, you don't, they can very easily make you forget everything that happens.
But some of it you don't remember even now, like, as you say, right? Just listening to you tell us these stories. I go, she doesn't remember that. They did that to her. I would be
You,
furious, Anne, if I were you. I would be
oh yeah.
so upset that they took these
No,
memories from me, what they did to me. And
they
I want to know
steal
what they
your
did.
life. They steal your life and they try to steal your soul. That's what they're doing. I bet, you could get Annaka on the, if we were talking, she would confirm, I think, some of the, the mechanics of what I'm trying to, she said a few things in the interview that said, it's a process. She says it's a complex process of recovering the memories, of processing of, some of it comes as flashbacks. Some of it comes as a pure, reliving.
Yeah.
But for me, only occasionally, and I was warned not to do it because it might be too traumatic.
Yeah.
So
Well, you said that, but if you had the opportunity to go back and get all of your memories restored without any kind of turmoil, would you do it?
sure. Yeah, somebody
Because
give
I'm
me the
I'm
transcript.
talking about all of them now. I'm not talking about just the good ones, I'm talking about all of it, because some of the shit they did to
Oh,
you,
yeah.
Anne, I'm sure it
I
was
think
pretty bad.
I think I am just scratching the surface of it, but like if they give me the transcript, I would read it. It's like sometimes I can't stand to watch a YouTube video because I just cannot cope with the personalities or some of the emotions, but I will willingly read the transcript, skim it, and you can distance yourself from a text. And that's
All
why
right.
writing is a very is a powerful tool because of the distancing, that's
Yeah.
possible.
Okay.
Objectivity.
We got to go. It's 2.5
All right.
hours. It's
Oh
two
my
and a half
God.
hours. It's late. But I'd love to have you back. You're going on a trip in a couple of weeks. Maybe you can come back on in the new year. We can talk more about this. I'd love to have you back
Or
on.
whatever. I'll be in Greece, but I could see you in the springtime or, but whatever. No, it's fun. And I don't know. Thank you very much.
Or you
Very
could do it from
therapeutic.
Greece. Right. I mean,
Yes,
how
you
far?
can.
What's the time
Sure.
difference in
Yeah.
Greece? We could record something, and we could talk more about the
It's
Rolling Stones thing. And I'm sure there's so many other stories that you have to tell that we didn't get to yet.
I don't know. I think I kind of covered a lot of it, but for now, I'm out of gas now. I've run out of gas. You're very patient.
All right. You go to
Anyway,
bed.
we'll stay
You
in
have a
touch.
great trip. Have a Merry Christmas, and we'll talk
Merry
to you again. And
Christmas.
thank you so much for coming
Happy
on.
Diwali. And thank you for inviting me. This has been so much fun. You're a very
Absolutely.
patient man. All right, now I'll tell everybody about your show. Anyway,
Okay,
be
thanks. I'll
well.
talk to you later.
Okay,
You too.
bye now.
Anne Diamond. She is a MK Ultra survivor, and she doesn't have a lot of her memories, you guys. She seems happy. She seems focused. She writes books. She writes books. Well, I'm not going to say she's focused completely, but when she starts to tell a story, and you may have noticed too that there was a delay between her and I. Her Wi-Fi wasn't working too great, and I think we had to wait for a second or two before she heard what I said, and then I jump in on top of her because I was so frustrated and angry, not with her, but with the stories that she was telling and the torture that these people had to endure as children. So this is a book that's based upon Anne's story. She wrote this in 2003. It's called My Cold War. There are other books on her website if you want to go check them out. A lot of them are fiction. Some of them have to do with her experiences as an MK Ultra victim. AnneDiamond.ca. Go check out the website at the very least. What a nice lady. Once again tonight, you guys, we've gone way over time. I understand that some of the platforms that are streaming the show tonight are buffering because we've been on so long. Don't worry, it will eventually take care of itself and you'll be able to watch the whole thing going forward. Some of you are having that issue, others are not. Don't forget, tomorrow night on the show, Randy Hillier, the one and only Randy Hillier, former Ontario Conservative MPP, and then former independent MPP. All of his charges were dismissed a couple of weeks ago. It's going to be a pleasure to have him on. Knowledgeable, entertaining, folksy. Randy Hillier joins the show tomorrow night. Friday night, there will be no show. I'm giving myself a little bit of a long weekend. I love you all. I appreciate you all. Don't forget, go become a member, an all-access member at shadowdavis.com. I'm going to do something special for you guys, for you all-access members this weekend on the website, shadowdavis.com, SHADOEDAVIS.com. Don't forget, even if you don't watch any of the extra content on the website, you are supporting the show for like $12 a month. And you know what? You don't have to get it for the entire year. You can get it for like 1 month at a time. And if you don't like it, then you can cancel. No harm, no foul. I will have no hard feelings. I love you all. I appreciate you all. And I will catch you again tomorrow night, 8 o'clock Central. Bye for now.